This man who ran a racket of child abuse, why do we call it abuse? Of the rape and torture of children for generations, decades, and across a wide swathe of the country. And it's not in spite of his religion, it's because of it. And I think it's evasive to pretend otherwise. Now, there's the question of, well, some people think, well, religion's been distorted, bad things are done in the name of it. Well, I can't arbitrate this really. I mean, at present in Iran, the ancient and noble civilization of Persia has been run into the ground by an Islamic theocracy, headed by an Ayatollah who claims to rule the country in the sense of owning it. The religious doctrine is called the Velayat-i-Faqih, the guardianship of the clergy. It makes everyone in Iran into a child who's a ward of the theocrats. Now, he's the current Supreme Guardian Council chairman. The other most senior cleric in Iran, the Ayatollah Montazeri, who I've been writing about for years now, says this is not true. He says it's actually a satanic republic, that the Ayatollahs who rule currently are agents of hell, that everything they're doing is evil and cruel and condemned by God. Do I know which of these Ayatollahs is right? I don't. It's not my job to arbitrate Shia theological disputes. I've been to the country and seen what these disputes have done to it. I think an arguable proposition would be this. Iran would be better off if neither of those Ayatollahs had the power to make rulings of this kind. If people were able to think for themselves and decide for themselves without being told that they're children of God and must be bossed around by those who possess God's will, his work. Now, it's objected to this, well, think of the beautiful things that religion does, sonnets, symphonies. I'm all for the transcendent. I'm all for the numinous. Everyone feels it. Combinations of love, landscape, music, and so forth. We don't know that the people who wrote those devotional music pieces were believers. We know what would have happened to them if they said they were not. We know the same about the painters and the sculptors. They would not have been able to say if they were skeptics. We know that Verdi, for example, could do a very good requiem, but he wasn't a believer. It's not correct at all to claim the achievements of art as if they were the products of the supernatural. These are products of human culture. Now, against all the Ayatollahs that have ever existed, against all the priests, and all the rabbis and imams, I would propose the figure of Socrates. It's quite possible he didn't exist. We have no proof of it. We have not much more proof than we have of the existence, say, of Jesus of Nazareth, who I regard as a fictional, quasi-mythical figure, or Moses, an undoubtedly invented figure who ordered his people to commit rape, torture, slavery, and genocide against all other peoples before dragging them to the one place in the Middle East that has no oil. I've only got a minute. Socrates wasn't like that. Socrates, I think from the testimony of eyewitnesses, probably did exist. Anyway, it doesn't matter to me if he didn't, you see, because I don't need supernatural permission to think for myself, which is what he taught me to do. He said, the height of wisdom is to know how little you know, to have a rough idea of how ill-educated you are, of how far you have to go, to understand that things are based upon uncertainty and debate. Against this, to say, we already have all the moral information we need, it's been given to us by the universe, aka God, is childish, when we have in our hands, already, innate, born with us, the opportunity of our self-emancipation. To think for ourselves, this does not lead to moral chaos and anarchy. It doesn't mean everyone does anything they like. If it were true, we wouldn't be sitting here. We couldn't have evolved this far. Our species, if it wasn't based on solidarity, on brotherhood and sisterhood, on mutual aid, on the things that are evolutionarily necessary for us to survive and prosper, wouldn't be having this conversation. But the demand that you circumcise the genitalia of children, the demand that, in one religion, that Jews be considered collectively guilty for the murder of Jesus, think of what that teaching has led to. The demand for holy war, the demand for the oppression and shaming of women, the demand for the stoning of adulterers, all these things, totally surplus to our moral and social requirements, are specifically preached as religious imperatives. The difference, therefore, between a reasoned, philosophical, non-supernatural morality with its own humanistic limits that are understood, And the attempt to interpret instructions that never came from an entity that does not exist is all the difference in the world. And the way to moral and intellectual health lies in the recognition of that. Thank you.
First of all, nobody said that Handel's Messiah or dumb sonnets were products of God. Of course they're products of human culture. The question was, what can human beings do that are motivated by faith that people who aren't motivated by faith wouldn't do? Having answered the question, am I having answered the question? I think Mr. Hitchens is changing it. No, I didn't interrupt you. Come on. Manners is also civility is a good religious virtue. Okay, so no, you can read, but it's not okay. No. Thank you. Fine. Are you done? Okay. Obviously, you're not done. You're still not done. The second point that I want to make, the second fallacy that Mr. Hitchens tried to sneak by you, is proposing Socrates as a model of a non-religious, free-thinking person when Socrates repeatedly invokes the gods. Repeatedly. Socrates always acknowledged a supernatural sanction to what he was saying and doing. And in fact, he says, as you know, in that very moving death scene recorded by Plato, when he says to the Athenian republic that condemns him to death, he says, I go to death and you stay in life, and who is better? Only the gods know. Right? Believing that there is a life after death, which is another conversation that we ought to have, although I have too much to catch up on at the moment, and he just said, sure do. In the Encyclopedia of Wars, not casual bedtime reading, there are 1,763 wars, major wars, that have been chronicled since the beginning of recorded history. Of those, do you know how many were religious wars? 123. In other words, the vast majority of conflict in human history has not been religious conflict. It's been conflict over land, water, politics, money, all the things that people fight about. And yet every time religion is in some way touching it, people assume that it's a religious conflict. And the same thing happens when people do wicked things. If they are anywhere in the vicinity of a religious institution, the assumption is that religion has caused them to do wicked things. In fact, you can reverse this and look at how religion has not prevented people from doing very wicked things, which is true, but every time you take religion out of political power, you discover something fascinating. Look at America. America is a very religious country. 80, 90, 95% in poll after poll say they believe in God, whatever that means. And yet, emancipation of women, charitable funds all over the country, freedom, science, public debate, all these things are not only made possible because religion isn't in the government, but because it is a religious country, and religion is allowed to flourish in a sort of capitalist, if you will, religious economy, which means different religions can compete with one another, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. And if that's allowed to happen, what you discover is that the best of religion rises. In the same way that in debate, the best of reason rises. In the same way that in science, if it's open and it's not closed, and we know now what happens with science when it's closed off, in science, if it's open, the best of science flourishes. That's a human characteristic, it's not a religious characteristic. Whereas if you take people and you give them power and you cloister them and you let nobody watch them, they're going to do bad things, whether they're in government, whether they're in church, whether they're in universities, whether they're in any institution that gives people power and doesn't give them accountability. But you know that accountability in the religious tradition is not only accountability to people around you, it's also an accountability to something greater. And when people take that seriously, it changes their lives. It is rare, in my experience, for someone to have any kind of conversion experience and become a worse person. Think about it. Think about the people you know who have become religious. Has it made them worse?